Well, the Trump administration urging more cooperation from China in pressuring North Korea. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, in fact, calling the rising nuclear tensions with the rogue regime a, quote, global problem, just hours after the North launched yet another ballistic missile that flew over our ally, Japan. McMaster also saying a military option is on the table. Joining us now, Riley Walters, a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Whenever we talk military options here, you want to know exactly what, if, when. Military options are on the table. We've heard the president say, we'll see. What do they mean by military options being on the table? What will it take for us to actually get involved militarily?
A military conference can be very escalatory. Usually people consider either a preemptive or a preventative attack. Both can, of course, escalate quickly. I think the focus should, of course, continue to be diplomatic and economic actions by both the United States unilaterally or trying to force China and the UN to engage more in the sanctions that have been asked for and future in sanctions as well.
It all falls on China. The question is, how do you force China to do this? Because, I mean, for years, they could have cut Pyongyang off years ago. It still supplies oil to North Korea. I mean, and then now North Korea has this missile that they launched over Japan this week. And in particular, talk about this missile that was launched, because it's extremely alarming if you don't know what this missile is capable of.
Sure. So the Hwasong-12 was launched over the northern territory of Japan, and the distance that it traveled is potential to hit the U.S. territory of Guam. China, on the other hand, certainly the Chinese government could be more vocal in its anti-Korea rhetoric. Certainly that's what we'd like to see, but through the history of both the UN with Russia, China has been reluctant to implement sanctions against North Korea. The U.S. can act unilaterally by targeting Chinese entities that have been found to help the North Korean regime, either with limiting their access to U.S. financial markets or even fines, charging them money to pay for it.
And so Secretary Tillerson said in a statement on Thursday that we call on all nations to take new measures against the Kim regime. China supplies North Korea with most of its oil. Russia is the largest employer of North Korean forced labor. China and Russia must indicate their intolerance for these reckless missile launches by taking direct actions of their own. What is it going to take for China to cut all ties off with North Korea?
I think it would be hard to cut off all ties for China. Certainly they have a long history, but they can move more toward a more diplomatic solution. They say that they're opposed to it, but obviously through action they've been reluctant. The U.S., again, it can target Chinese entities. It could talk with the Chinese government both officially and unofficially. It's seeming more and more likely that Trump will visit China later this year in November, and North Korea will certainly be at the top of the talking list. During that time, he can encourage both the Chinese government, which will have just sort of passed through its own party Congress, to be more vocal against its helping of North Korea, or not just the government, but Chinese entities within China, calling out those companies that have been shown to help the Kim regime.
What if China and Russia really did upheld the toughest UN sanctions ever that we've been talking about? How would further isolation then sit with North Korea?
Certainly. I mean, Kim himself would be certainly a hard one to dissuade. It seems more and more likely that he is coming to a pinnacle within his nuclear ambitions, but the missile tests will potentially be continuous for the long term. These sort of sanctions and diplomatic actions are meant more to target the elites, the people who work for Kim, the people who work for the people who work for Kim, sort of incentivizing them to change in the long run. And that's the emphasis. I mean, we have to recognize that North Korea is in possession of nuclear capabilities, but in the future, we want to incentivize change to get away from this rhetoric that they continue to espouse about destroying the U.S. and our allies.
I mean, Kim Jong-un has used some very strong words and basically warning of retaliation if these tough sanctions were actually implemented. You suggest the U.S. should target more Chinese banks. So there's the United States and how we could put pressure on Chinese officials and their banking system. I mean, the Chinese officials need need to cut the banks off too. I mean, it's not just the United States. So they basically need to block funds, all funds that go into North Korea. So China's banks right now, what are they doing in order to monitor them and try to assist in this issue?
Certainly. I mean, the thing that we want to be very explicit about is that the U.S. is very intolerant of this regime, and that we will increase costs for North Koreans and entities that help North Korea in its missile and nuclear programs. And by enacting all these programs, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to show these entities that the U.S., the UN, and China to a certain degree are unaccepting and will increase the cost for these things. Now, China itself can be more implementative of both UN and its own actions. Certainly, UN itself can implement greater scrutiny against Chinese actions, North Korean actions, and of course, those other countries, not just China and Russia, but Southeast Asian countries that have been helpful of the Kim regime.
We're going to be hearing a lot about this at the UN, as the president also will be speaking at the UN for the very first time, and Nikki Haley. So we'll stay tuned to that. Very busy week ahead. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Riley Walters.